I propose to use the Bright data test as a way of determining how LLMs do with certain kinds of legal reasoning questions. The name of the test, the Bright data test, comes from a case that's going on now between Reddit and Anthropic. Reddit sued Anthropic for breach of contract. Anthropic removed the case to federal court, citing, among other things, this Bright data case, which is up here on the screen. Reddit argued in its motion to remand that the Bright data case does not support removal. And so the legal analysis question is, what can Anthropic say in its response? This is the classic kind of question that a junior associate would get as a legal research question. We cited Bright data in our notice of removal. They say it doesn't support us. What do we say in response? What makes this a tricky question and an interesting question to give to LLMs is that, at least in my view, there's nothing to say. The case actually doesn't support removal, and I've explained the legal reasoning behind that in detail in another video, which there'll be a link to. But the idea is that's what makes this a tricky legal question, because the actual correct answer is there isn't any way to explain the case. You just have to say something else. You have to move on. You have to focus on something else. And by the way, that's exactly what Anthropic did in its actual opposition to the motion to remand. Today, what I want to do is look at the actual results that you get by giving the Bright data test to 3 different LLMs, the 3 frontier models that people are using these days: ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and Anthropic's Claude. And so let's look at them. What I've done with each of them is I've given them exactly the same context. I've given them the complaint, the notice of removal, and the motion to remand. And I have also given them approximately 25 cases, including the Bright data case, but also a number of the other cases cited in these motions as context. So let me start with ChatGPT. I turned on the advanced reasoning model, and then I created them as separate projects, and I've basically asked the same question to each one. There's a third question. I've asked each one 3 questions. The first is sort of a table setting question. The second is the ultimate question. And then the third is a question for some clarification, and we'll see what they do. And I have to say, it's interesting. So let's just look at it. So I asked ChatGPT, started with the first question: summarize Reddit's argument in footnote 8 of its motion to remand regarding Anthropic's citation of X Corp versus Bright data. So that's the argument, and it does. It thinks for 40 seconds. We can actually see the thinking here as it reads the document, and this just sort of, again, level sets. It shows me that it's reading the case, it's reading the brief, and it's understanding what's going on, namely that the argument here is that case doesn't support complete preemption, which would be a basis for removal. It only supports conflict preemption, which is not a basis for removal. And so then I ask it the sort of ultimate question. We're representing Anthropic. Read the Bright data case and any of the other cases cited in our notice of removal or Reddit's motion to remand, and explain how we should respond to Reddit's claim that Bright data does not support our argument for removing the case to federal court. I've turned on the thinking mode here, ChatGPT 5 thinking. It thinks for 40 seconds, and you can see that thinking here. And it responds, here's what to do. It says this case, the reasoning of Reddit's pleading fits Reddit's pleading like a glove. So this case is on point. It gives a reason of why Reddit's conflict versus complete preemption misses the mark. And here it's not bad. It says, look, we aren't using Bright data as a jurisdictional hook. We are, but we are citing it for 301, complete preemption. And then it goes on to say, so even if Bright data used conflict preemption language, its substantive equivalence analysis is exactly what the district courts used to find complete preemption. So it makes this argument that essentially this is form over substance. The analysis for conflict preemption is really the same as the analysis for complete preemption, even if the court didn't use those words. And by the way, I would say that is completely wrong. As I explained in the other video, I just don't think that's correct. But that's the answer it gives. And then it sort of proposes to go through and do some other, look at other things, cite other cases, and then how to frame it in the brief, lead with a different case, but again, point out that bright data is substantively equivalent, and then reinforce with some other cases. So what ChatGPT is basically saying is, yeah, I'm summarizing here, you should, this doesn't support you jurisdictionally, and you should acknowledge that. But there's a lot that you can cite this case for because its analysis is basically the same as a jurisdictional analysis. So you should turn it around on them and say, no. Sure, it didn't do complete preemption analysis. It did conflict analysis, but that's fine. It's the same kind of analysis. And then cite some other cases. And I would say it's that second part that is at best not a good argument, and I would probably argue even wrong. And so I asked it a third question. I pressed it on that argument. I said, well, explain that argument to me and cite bright data. And so it did. It gives the 301 analysis. It quotes X Corp, and it gives some quotes from the bright data case. And it says, so see, you can use this to say that there are no extra elements, which is the complete preemption test. It did an extra element analysis, and so this is relevant, which again, I don't think it did, and I put that question to it in a follow-up. Doesn't bright data expressly say it's not doing an extra elements analysis, but rather a conflict preemption analysis? It thinks about that for a while, and it says, you're right, it does frame it as conflict preemption, but it still lays out the 301 framework and explains why it undermines the scheme, and that makes bright data powerful substantive support for our characterization of Reddit's claims, even if our jurisdictional hook comes from complete preemption. And so it goes on to say, our precise response should be acknowledge the label, but use bright data's substantive analysis. So even after, so its initial attempt was to say, yes, the case is not jurisdictional, but its substantive analysis still applies. And even when I pressed it and said, it doesn't say that. It says it's doing a different substantive analysis. It's doing conflict analysis, which depends on whether or not which looks at whether or not the state law undermines the federal law, as opposed to preemption analysis, which is whether they're coextensive. It nevertheless persists in saying use bright data's substantive analysis. So I would say that ChatGPT under the bright data test has done at best a mediocre, maybe even a bad job in terms of its legal analysis of this question. Let's move on to Gemini, which is Google's. I did this by using Notebook LLM, which lets me put a bunch of all the cases in the briefing as sources, and I asked it exactly the same question to set the table, summarize Reddit's argument, and it again does a pretty good job of this. It says it's the wrong type of preemption. You need complete preemption for removal, and this distinction is important. So it's not applicable. So it gets the summary right as well. I then ask it the question, okay, we're Anthropic, what do we say? And it says, similar answer to ChatGPT. Acknowledge the distinction, but pivot to the underlying rationale. We should begin by acknowledging that Reddit is correct, but we must immediately pivot to argue that the reasons why the Bright Data Court found conflict preemption are the same reasons this court should use to find complete preemption. The argument that, as I explained before, I think is just wrong. And it also cites this obstacle test, which again, I don't think it's typically framed that way, but is the test for conflict preemption, but not for complete preemption. And again, it goes on to make some conflict preemption arguments, but those are really not complete preemption arguments. And then it too sort of says, well, you can cite other things, make other arguments. But it's again, and here we are, a summary of our response strategy, embrace the substantive reasoning of Bright Data. And so I ask it, again, a pointed question like I did with ChatGPT. How can we embrace the substantive reasoning? Doesn't it use a different substantive reasoning, conflict rather than extra element? And it says, you're right to point that out. It acknowledges that there are two different tests. And then it says they're not mutually exclusive inquiries, though. They're different ways of evaluating the same core issue. And here's how we can embrace Bright Data's reasoning to counter Reddit's argument. And suppose we should argue the extra elements test and then explain that Bright Data shows this is merely repackaging, which is not what Bright Data holds. And then it goes on to say Bright Data's reasoning shows the state law claims are an obstacle, but again, obstacle is not the test. And it sort of summarizes by saying this notion that I think is weak at best, which is that the Bright Data decision provides a detailed roadmap for why Reddit's state law claims are not qualitatively different from copyright claims, even if they appear to have extra elements. And that's just not what Bright Data says. It's certainly not a good, strong reading of it. So I would say Google Gemini, under the Bright Data test, does not do a good job on the legal analysis. Again, it's trying to argue that even under sort of pressure, it's arguing we should make this point that the reasoning of the Bright Data decision supports us when, again, I don't think it does at all. I think conflict preemption analysis is a different analysis than complete preemption, and so it doesn't support it. And so now let's look at Claude, the third frontier model, and same kind of thing. We're using Opus 4.1 here, the most advanced Claude model. We've turned on reasoning. That's what this extended thinking is. Anyway, we've turned it on here for Opus and asked it the same exact question, summarize the argument. As with the others, it does a good job of summarizing the argument. We then asked it the same ultimate issue question, what do we say as Anthropic? And it does its own thinking and reads through. And here it says, gives a similar answer. Anthropic's reframe Bright Data's holding. They're correct that it is about conflict preemption, but the case's reasoning actually supports complete preemption. Again, this kind of form over substance over form argument, and which I just don't think is correct when it comes to conflict versus complete preemption. And so it says, argue that Bright Data's reasoning supports complete preemption, and then go on to emphasize the extra element test, argue policy, and maybe argue this other doctrine. So then we ask it again, we press it as well. How does the substantive holding of Bright Data about incompatibility support complete, not merely conflict preemption? Doesn't Bright Data explicitly say it is doing conflict analysis, not complete preemption? And isn't the test for a conflict fundamentally different than the test for an extra element in complete preemption? And it says, you're right, the tests are different. This does actually hurt Anthropic's position. So actually, this is the first time we're seeing a model that says, you're right, this actually does hurt your position. And your better argument is distinguish Bright Data procedurally, focus on cases that actually address complete preemption, and argue Reddit's claims lack the extra element. And then it goes on to say, the honest assessment. Reddit has the stronger argument here. Bright Data's explicit use of conflict preemption analysis combined with Ninth Circuit precedent make it difficult to use Bright Data to support removal. The fact that a federal court found these types of claims conflict doesn't mean they're completely preemptive for jurisdictional purposes. Anthropic's best strategy might be to minimize reliance on Bright Data, focus on other cases, argue in the alternative, and consider whether they have stronger grounds for removal. So this is very interesting. Claude, under pressure, is the only one of the frontier models that actually gives what I would say is the right answer, which is, you know what? They're right. We're wrong. Reddit's right. Anthropic's wrong. This case doesn't support us. We've got to argue something else. Now, does that mean Claude's great? I don't know. It didn't give it on the first question. It only gave it when I pressed it on the point. So in other words, it only gave it when I had essentially read the case and said to it, I don't understand. The case doesn't seem to say this. So its first analysis was still wrong. But it's interesting that Claude is the only one of the three models that under the Bright Data test is actually giving eventually the right answer, which is that this case just doesn't support the argument you want to make. I'm going to leave it at that. I think it's a pretty interesting result. I'm very interested to see if other people use this Bright Data test with either different prompting strategies or with different tools or maybe different models. I really encourage people to start thinking about how can we test how these models actually do on legal reasoning.